Thanks. What we're going to be talking about today is adapting to change and how both humans and machines adapt to change. So we'll start by talking about change and how it relates to stress. Something like 2,500 years ago, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus suggested that the only constant is change. And we don't really know if he was the first one to suggest that. I imagine probably not. But I think he was probably right. The only real constant is probably change. Part of what he left out, though, is that change is also stressful, and especially when it requires adaptation to survive. So species throughout history, the history of our planet, have discovered this the hard way, unfortunately, even plant species. And we also see that in our own lives. There's different kinds of problems that you can have as a result, really, of changes in your life and the world around you. The release of stress hormones as a result of change is fairly well documented. I think we've all felt that. But why? Why should change cause stress? Since change is a constant and has been forever, wouldn't you think by now we would have evolved to adapt to change and even thrive based on change? And some people do. Well, I'd suggest that it's often because change requires adaptation, and even when it doesn't, there's a potential that needs to be evaluated. Do I need to change? Do I need to do something different? And as those changes happen around you, that's something that you're wondering about and deciding whether or not you need to take action. We can't always be sure that we don't need to change something. So adapting to change can take many forms, as we've seen recently. So, for example, moving a restaurant outside. Of course, many restaurants already were outside, but in many cases, they couldn't be indoors because you couldn't have gatherings of people inside. And I think we've all seen that people and animals and plants that are resilient, that react to change well, tend to thrive. But the type of adaptation that I'm going to talk about mostly today is mental adaptation. Changing the way you think, the way you behave, the way you approach the world. And you do that really by physically changing your brain. So you do it, I do it, animals do it, and it turns out that machine intelligences also do it. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. How does the brain work? Well, in order to consider how the brain changes in response to change, we need to consider how it works. And we don't really fully understand how the brain works. But one of the leading theories at the moment is called the thousand brains theory, which is based on a lot of neuroscience and some really amazing imaging techniques that have really studied the brain at a very granular level. So we'll use that as the focus of how we try to understand the brain today. But I should say there's other approaches to trying to understand the brain as well. The neocortex is a key part of what we need to consider. This is the outermost layer of the brain. It seems to be very involved in learning. It's about 2.5 millimeters thick. And if you spread it out, it would be about the size of a dinner napkin. But it makes up about 70% of our brains. Only mammals have a neocortex. And the human neocortex contains many of the functions that really make us human. So it's often called the organ of intelligence. It's divided into dozens of regions that each have different functions and do different things, the visual cortex and so forth. But the curious thing is, all those regions look pretty much the same. Even on a cellular level, there's some slight differences. But they look very similar, and that's odd, because if you look at other parts of the brain that also have different functions, like the hippocampus, for example, they look very different. So why does the neocortex have this uniformity across it? Well, in the late 1800s, Santiago Ramón y Cajal used the latest imaging technology at the time to look into the brain and understand different parts of it. And in the neocortex, he found these vertical layers of connections that formed columns. And today we call those cortical columns. And it's pretty uniform throughout the neocortex. We have about 150,000 of them in our brains. So for years, that was kind of a curiosity. Why is that like that? And then in 1978, a researcher named Vernon Mountcastle proposed the idea that the reason that all the cortical columns, and remember they have different functions, they're doing different things, but the reason that they all look the same is that they all function the same. And the thing that really differentiates them is their inputs and outputs. So that stepping forward, for many years, like 30 years, we start the beginnings of the 1,000 brains theory. And one of the key concepts that proposes is that the reason for that uniformity is that cortical columns are generating reference frames, and they're interpreting the world and performing all their functions through the creation of reference frames. So what is a reference frame? Well, the easiest way to understand it is the reference frames that we have for our world, how we understand space in the world. So I have a reference frame, you have a reference frame, you're in a certain direction from me at a certain distance. That's our positional reference frame. And in the brain, we see neurons called place and grid neurons that represent our places, and as we move through the world, we activate different ones of those, and we form this kind of a map in our head about where things are. But one of the key ideas that is starting to gain more evidence is that it's not just places and space, it's ideas, including language. And if you're familiar with embedding spaces in deep learning, this is going to be very familiar. The idea that there's a relationship that can be expressed in a spatial relationship based on the dimensions of that particular item. So those two form reference frames, and when we adapt to the world, as the world changes, it's those relationships that we really need to change. If we had to adapt physically, like if I had to grow a third arm or something, you can imagine how difficult that would be for the body to do, adapting physically like that. But in fact, we do adapt physically when we make changes. At the cellular level in our brains, we change how individual neurons reach out and connect to other neurons. And we do it at an organized level to do things like change our reference frames about how we understand language and ideas and thought and the state of the world. The brain already consumes about 20% of the energy that is required to run a human, and making those changes adds some additional energy burden. We don't know exactly how much. So interestingly, though, when we respond to changes that seem beneficial, the level of stress that we go through is much lower or non-existent. But when we respond to something that I'm going to call threatening change, then we generate stress hormones, which complicate the situation in our brains and how we adapt. So that's probably our lizard brain, what I would call our lizard brain at work, pumping out those stress hormones. But unlike the typical situation when we learn something for the first time, we need to try to respond to this change and relearn and change those connections in the presence of all these hormones telling us to fight or flight and all these things. Okay, so how does that relate to machine intelligence? We talked about human intelligence. Well, and I'm going to focus really here on neural networks. There's other types of machine intelligence, but this is really going to focus on neural networks. So in neural networks, we have neurons. They're a very crude simulation of a actual brain neuron. But they work essentially by adjusting the weights and biases. There's numbers associated with each neuron that control how they respond to the different features that are fed into them. And there can easily be billions of those. For a GPT-3 model, there's something like 175 billion parameters that need to be adjusted for that model to learn. So the vast majority of machine learning today is what's called supervised learning. It's certainly not all of it, but especially in industry, the vast majority that's actually being used, in applications is supervised learning. So we're going to take a little detour here for a second and understand supervised learning. One of the things that we need for supervised learning are the correct answers, because supervised learning is learning by example. So you have a bunch of examples that you're going to show to the model. Each of those examples has a correct answer, and based on how the model does, there's an error signal that's back propagated through the model to adjust those parameters. Okay, so you are going to be our models today, and we're going to learn about supervised learning. This is a gecko. So this is the beginning of our training data to train our models. So take a good look and try to remember what a gecko looks like. This is a chameleon. Okay? Maybe you're already familiar with these, but if you're not, take a good look. Another gecko. So you start to notice some commonality, but there's differences. Another chameleon. Another gecko. And another chameleon. Okay, so now you're trained. We've trained our model. And we stopped there. So now we're going to run inference, or we're going to have you generate predictions. So what about this? Is it a gecko or a chameleon? I heard a mix there, but this is a gecko. Gecko or chameleon? Good. Okay, that was pretty. Okay, gecko or chameleon? Good. Okay, good. See, different, but you start to notice the commonality. That's called generalizing. So it's not exactly what you were trained with, but it has characteristics in common with what you were trained with. So you can generalize to things you haven't seen before. Gecko or chameleon? Yeah, it's a bit harder, isn't it? So that's because you, our model, weren't really trained to recognize this one. That could be, let's imagine, a result of change. Maybe this is a new species that's emerged. Or maybe you as a model are being put in an area, a new part of the world where these geckos live and you haven't seen one before. And it looks different enough that you're not sure how to predict what the right answer is here. That's change. And you as a model are struggling with that change. So we need to help you. That's actually not a new species. It's called a satanic leaf-tailed gecko, and I think it lives in Southeast Asia, if I remember right. But you get the point. So let's stop for a moment and ask, how do we as humans know when we need to change? Well, one theory is that constantly we are making tiny little predictions about what we expect from the world. So I expect if I drop my clicker here, it's going to drop to the floor. And if it doesn't, that's going to set off alarm bells and say, ooh, wait a minute, my model of the world is wrong. Something's different here, and maybe I need to change how I think. Maybe there's a table here or something that I wasn't aware of. So that's, and that's going to include how other humans interact with us as well. So if we go into a situation where we expect other humans to behave in a certain way and they don't, that's also going to have an impact on our view of the world. When we detect that there is change, we start to adapt. Machines, for their expectations, that's really all based on what they've been trained with. And the training data that they were given is a snapshot of a particular state of the world, the state of the world when that data was gathered. So if it was gathered 10 years ago, that's 10 years old. It's the machine, the model only knows about the world as it was 10 years ago. So there are some advanced models that do try to monitor the current state of the world in a really limited sense, but we're going to ignore that for now. So instead, models are trained and then frozen. Their view of the world is frozen in time. So that means that their understanding of the world is frozen in time. So instead, they have to rely on us, their humans, their developers, to help them move forward in time and adapt as the world changes around them. That depends what they're doing. If they're recognizing, cats and dogs or text and just trying to recognize letters on a page, those things don't change very fast. Other things do change fairly quickly. But remember that supervised learning requires labels too. So that means that humans, well, it depends. There's different ways of gathering labels. But in a lot of domains, humans actually look at data and label that data with the right answers. Now that's something that just about anybody can do in some areas, like recognizing cats and dogs. But in other areas like medicine or manufacturing, you can be asking an expert to, say, look at an X-ray or the scan of a phone screen and decide, is that a broken bone or is that a defect? So that can be a challenge, and it's getting enough data to retrain that model can really be a challenge. The easiest labels to gather, of course, are the ones that you can do automatically. So, for example, when you click on something as the result of a recommendation that you were given, there's a direct connection there that you can automatically gather the right answer for that. This has real-world consequences. So, especially when the model's part of a critical system, like an autonomous vehicle, for example, change can be catastrophic. But even in things like market predictions or demand forecasting or fraud detection, all of those things change, and they change on a fairly frequent basis, and those models need to adapt to that change. Because of the fact that change is constant, and because of the need for machine intelligence to adapt to change, and because of the use of machine learning in critical systems, over the last few years, MLOps has been created and grown fairly quickly. You could view MLOps itself as an adaptation of traditional DevOps, which is used in software, but with the added complications of machine learning added to it. So let's talk for a bit about DevOps and MLOps and production ML, using machine learning in a product or service or business process. So as data scientists, we tend to focus on our models, and most of what we've been talking about is our models. And that's natural, because really that's where the magic happens in a machine learning system. But a production solution, something you're going to use in a product or service or business process, requires a lot more than just the model. At Google, we've measured the code for a model to be something like 5% of the code necessary to put that model into production. All the other things that you see here are critical to success. If those things aren't there or they go wrong, things can break. So for any machine learning development, you need all the things that you need for machine learning, things like the labeled data that we've talked about. And crafting that data. Does it cover the same feature space as the prediction requests that you're going to get? Have you worked to try to optimize things like minimizing dimensionality? Fairness and equity and responsible AI are increasingly important, and it's really, especially in a business, very important to consider those. And rare conditions, like we've talked about healthcare, for example, or autonomous vehicles, making sure that the model is able to handle those correctly, or that you have some sort of a fallback business rule so that those things are handled correctly. And a lot of this gets down to life cycle management. So managing the life cycle of the data schemas, the model itself, and the systems, that becomes incredibly important to success. But along with that, you've got all the things that you need to do in any modern software development. This is the DevOps portion. So things like scalability and extensibility, have you written it to be modular, best practices, testable. Testable is a little bit trickier in an ML system because you have not just the software itself, not just the code, but you have the model and the data around that. So, and monitoring. Monitoring is incredibly important. Again, a little weird, a little different with machine learning, because monitoring whether or not the model is giving you the right answers is part of what you need to monitor. And to do that, you need to know what the right answer should be. And safety and security. There are attacks that can happen against models, so you need to be aware of that and try to account for it. Unfortunately, people have often learned this the hard way. So this is a kind of a famous tweet right now where they train a model in 3 months, which is, reasonable. But 11 months later, it still isn't in production because they discovered they needed all the rest of it besides just the model. So at Google, we have exactly that same problem, or we had. We still do. But our research team went out, did a lot of research, and we've gone through 3 generations of machine learning infrastructure at Google. And the latest is what's called TFX, which is an open source platform that you can use today to do MLOps and production machine learning. So we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about TFX. So we've talked about change. Now let's talk a bit about process, because you need a production process to manage all this. The heart of this is what's grown in the community as around this consensus of the idea of MLOps. And there's different definitions for it, but they all kind of arrive at the same place. So a key part of this is automation and monitoring. You need this to be an automated process. You can start out doing this manually, and we'll look at that in a second. But when you really get into a production environment, this has to be something that is automated and monitored and maintainable. So you need continuous integration, just like you do for software development. But with MLOps, it also has to include the model itself and the data schemas. You can have, data where it suddenly changes. You have a feature that changes from an int to a float because maybe a sensor changed or something. So even the schema needs to be managed. Continuous deployment, also, we still need that. But now it's not just about the code itself, but managing the deployment of that model and those data sets, not just into the training system, but into the serving system as well. And continuous training is unique to MLOps. We really don't see this in DevOps. And this is the idea of helping your model adapt to change. So it's really focused on automatically gathering new data, because you're going to need data to retrain your model to help it adapt to change. And then an automated process to retrain that model to improve performance and check to see whether you've actually improved the model or not, because you can retrain a model and have it do worse. So you don't want to be in that situation. But continuous training is a key part of this as well. For any machine learning development, there's a sequence of tasks that you go through. So you start by, first you start by gathering data, and then you ingest the data into a pipeline, and you try to understand it. So you do things like validating it, checking the schema, and so forth, looking for anomalies, looking for issues, trying to do cleanup, and so forth. Then you're going to do some transformation of the data to try to make it easier for the model to learn from it, which is called feature engineering. And then you're going to train the model itself. And then you're going to evaluate the performance of the model, how well it does on metrics that are relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve. And then, if it actually does better than what you already have, and remember it might not, you're going to push it into your serving infrastructure. So to do that in a TFX system, we have a set of libraries in the middle there, in gray, that are open source libraries that are used by the components in orange to perform those different tasks. So ingesting the data, calculating statistics across it, doing the transformations for feature engineering, training the model, tuning hyperparameters for the model, doing the evaluation. We also do something called infravalidator, where you actually push the trained model into a sort of a sandbox and make sure that it will actually run. And then finally, if it passes all the tests, you push it to your production environment. So you can start out with MLOps, and small teams or teams just starting out typically do, just doing all of this in a manual process. So that's fine, it works, and at least you're covering the bases. But you're going to fairly quickly outgrow that. And when you do, you'll move to what we call MLOps Level 1, where you're doing pipeline automation. So there's different parts of this. There's your development or experimentation, and these can be different shadow environments, which will include all of the pieces, but it's kept separate from your production environment. And then you have the production environment itself, often mirrored in a staging environment. And within that, you have the pipelines. The pipelines are really the hearts of these systems. So in both cases, you have a training pipeline that trains your model. And that's what TFX is for, is creating those training pipelines. There's a lot of other pieces that you see here that really aren't part of TFX. So as you might imagine, TFX is used all over Google, including Google Cloud and the Vertex products and so forth. And chances are pretty good if you've used Gmail today or YouTube or Chrome even, you've used something that used TFX. TFX, although it comes from the TensorFlow team, trains more than just TensorFlow. I mean, we love TensorFlow, but you often need other things because you have other people, other teams, or just particular people who want to use different frameworks. And often what happens is you'll get someone who has spent a lot of time and gone up the learning curve for a framework, and they want to just keep using that. They don't want to change to have to use something else. So maybe they moved from a team that was using XGBoost, and they would just want to stay with XGBoost. They resist change. Change. Seems like we've talked about that. Well, so how do you respond to change with machine intelligences? Well, first you gather data, like look for things you can measure. The thickness of a sandwich. And we as humans do the same thing. When we detect that we need to change, we go out and try to gather information and try to understand how the change has happened. However, we can learn from each other and from sources like media and text and books and so forth, or lectures. And machines really can't do that. They have to rely on humans to give them new data that reflects the new state of the world and help them adapt to change. Even help them through the learning process itself of adapting to change. So this again is the TFX model of things. If you're interested, there's a set of courses on Coursera that we put together that talks about more than just TFX. It's really production ML in the large. All the other things besides just the pipeline itself. There's also a community group. Remember, TFX is an open source project. It's out there on GitHub. You can clone the repo right now, and you can help as a community member to create new components and libraries and tooling and so forth to build on top of TFX. And there's a couple hundred people doing that right now. And there's some more information, some links I'll leave that up for a second in case anybody wants it. And that's my talk.